Good morning, everyone. My name is Shannon White. I'm a partner at Guidehouse in our Defense and Security segment, and I lead our Homeland Security and law enforcement practice that includes support to the Department of Homeland Security and to the Department of Justice. Every day, there are new threats to our nation's critical infrastructure, eroding confidence in the systems that we trust in to go about our daily lives. Guidehouse works with our clients to explore the key challenges that are being faced and help to mitigate risks which could impact secure operations and erode public trust in our infrastructure, which is why I'm especially pleased to introduce this session. What's in a name? Critical infrastructure, protection or resilience? The field of critical infrastructure began with a focus on protection, and in the past decade has pivoted toward a focus on resilience. So which is it? Protection or resilience, or does it matter? This panel will provide perspectives from critical infrastructure, owner-operators, and their allies, and what they are focusing on in an era of marked unpredictability. I would now like to introduce the moderator for this session, Ms. Emily Fry, who is at MITRE's Center for Securing the Homeland. Ms. Fry is a director for cyber integration. Prior to this role, Ms. Fry was the director of national protection and resilience. Ms. Fry has practiced law, moved a startup through 3 rounds of venture funding, served as the director of research for a think tank, and consulted extensively across technical and policy issues in both the public and private sectors. Her particular expertise brings together technical, legal, and business perspectives to inform homeland security risk and resilience management, cybersecurity policy, and critical infrastructure. This is why she's the perfect moderator for this panel. I'd like to now turn it over to Ms. Emily Fry.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you. And although not on the agenda, I have noticed Stuart Baker floating around here the last 2 days, and I would like to just take a moment to thank Stuart for launching me on this career. Back in 1996, when I first got out of law school, he basically set the course for what has become the last 30 years of working on critical infrastructure. So with us here today, we have a panel of amazing people, and I'm going to start at the far end because Justine has come the farthest of anyone in this room, and she's on California time. So thank you very much for joining us from San Diego, from DLA Piper, who brings together another set of perspectives, a West Coast set of perspectives about critical infrastructure, which we here on the East Coast can all benefit from listening to. And next to Justine, we have Greg Garrett, who at the moment he is with Peraton, but he, a fun fact from the past, was an F-16 fighter pilot and has published 24 books in his career. And closer in, we have Director Brandon Wales. And Director Wales is what some of us call an OG, an original gangster, which means someone who dates back to the founding and the very ambitious, rocky, catalytic period when we all brought together the Department of Homeland Security. And he has served a very wide range of roles across multiple parts of that department over the years. And closest to me, we have Mark Asta, who joins us from Duke Energy and has a very wide range of perspectives as well from one of our most important critical infrastructures. As we all know, nothing works without power. So thank you very much, all of you, for being here today. And I just want to kick it off by saying, the framing of this panel is about, the relationship between protection and resilience. And in the background, off and on, you're going to see the Dyer curve, which is how many of us have been taught to think through the concept of adding resilience into this space. In 2002, I took a job as the director of research at the Critical Infrastructure Protection Program, founded by Frank Wolf out of the George Mason School of Law, right? But we don't say that anymore, right? We say protection and resilience are both very, very important. So I want to ask each of you if you could just take a minute or two, talk about how you, in the focus that you are having in your work right now, are balancing those equities, protection, resilience, more of one, more of the other. How do they relate? Let's go ahead and start with you, Mark.
All right, thanks, Emily. Morning, everybody. I would say that both protection and resiliency are equally as important, because at the end of the day, a motivated threat actor is going to defeat your security controls. And if you don't have resiliency processes in place, you're going to lose your operations. So the way I look at it is severalfold. We have an intelligence-driven protection program. That is, we first and foremost identify what is our gold, what are our crown jewels. When we decide if we were to lose this asset or this process, would it hurt us or would it kill us? And when we say those things would kill us, that's what we identify as our gold. And how do we protect it? Because we can't protect everything equally, right? It's just not possible. We have limited budgets, limited staffing. And so we take our gold and we protect it utilizing intelligence-driven methods. We look at what are the threat actors, who's opposed to our operations, who's opposed to our business, what are their tactics, techniques, and procedures, and then we build our protections around the threat that exists. And the only way you can do that is with an intelligence program, right, to understand. And intelligence programs are comprised multifaceted. They're open source, they're relationships with governments, but you've got to know what the threat actors are going to do, and then you've got to protect against it. And as I said, at the end of the day, your security controls, if you have a dedicated threat actor, particularly funded by a nation state or a really motivated group, are going to fail. So to be able to have crisis management plans and business continuity or continuity of operations plans to get you back and running again are critical if you want to continue succeeding. And in our business, we have to provide uninterrupted power, right? That's not an option. So that is how we structure our protection versus criticality of resilience.
Mm-hmm. So will it hurt us or will it kill us? I think that's a pretty important question right there. Director Wales, thoughts on this?
I would say that the language here really reflects the evolution at the Department of Homeland Security. During the early days, obviously coming out of 9/11, the focus was on protection. What do we need to harden to make sure that terrorists could not once again cause significant loss of life in the homeland? August 2005, Hurricane Katrina, I think, started to change the dynamics at the department, recognizing that we needed a more all-hazards approach to the mission and raising the importance of resilience because we were never going to stop Mother Nature. And over the next several years, we were kind of rounding out the programs at the department and across various missions to make sure that we were more fully accounting for resilience. And fast forwarding to today, where cyber threats are kind of among the most significant ones that the department and our partners are working on, reflects the fact that you need equal parts security and resilience. You need to ensure that your systems are protected. The most important ones are hardened the most security, the most logging, the most oversight. But at the end of the day, adversaries are, as was said, likely to get through eventually. So we need to have a program that has the ability to compensate, to bounce back when their disruptions happen. And I think that that's, played out in real life in terms of what we expect when we see attacks and threats against critical infrastructure. So I think it has been a meaningful evolution over time, and frankly, it'll continue to evolve as our understanding of the infrastructure evolves, as our understanding of threats continue to change, and as we recognize what new techniques we need to employ to make sure at the end of the day that the most important functions that our country performs to make sure that our way of life can continue have the degree of resilience, have the degree of security and protection that they require.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And what are your thoughts on this, Greg, as you balance those equities between protection and resilience?
So it's a great question, and the first thought that comes to mind is $6 trillion. $6 trillion is the estimate of global damages from cybercrime last year. 44% of all cybersecurity attacks in the world were targeted against the United States. And the number one sector that they've targeted most recently is the U.S. public sector and our critical infrastructure industries. And so the question is how to do it holistically. Because to me, it's not a question of data protection or cyber resilience. You have to have both. And you have to have both through an integrated set of processes at a level of depth. And I like the thinking that Mark said, it's security by design. And too often, our security has in the past been an afterthought, and it wasn't how we originally designed our systems. So at Peraton, we're really embracing the concepts and the application of what's called zero trust architecture. And that's really creating compartmentalization, data segmentation, micro perimeters, segmentation gateways. So you're controlling the access to the data within the internal system. So it's really going beyond just the perimeter-based firewall to that integrated defense in depth capability. Now, often when people talk about business continuity planning and disaster recovery, what they're really talking about is, okay, I've been attacked, I didn't mitigate it in the timely fashion, and so now I have to have a data replication or an air-gapped data backup system of some sort. And of course, that's very important, but what's more important is to mitigate the damage from the attack to begin with. So it's through that architecture that I mentioned, or it's through rapid incident response capabilities, bringing in AI, machine learning, with security orchestration and automated response. So we can do automated response and incident response playbooks to get that really rapid incident mitigation capabilities. So I think you have to do all of those as a part of a holistic defense in depth. It's not one or the other.
All right, Greg, you made some excellent points here. Thank you for bringing up time horizons, right? What is most urgent when we respond? Not everything can come first. So how do we prioritize our response? How do we also prioritize our defense in depth planning, right, in order to make it more resistant to come down to begin with? The other important point, which you touched on, we may not have time to discuss here, but the concept of automated response and how does that relate to where we have to have human response, I think is very important in this protection and resilience mix. And Justine, bring us your perspective from the work that you do.
From the West, the perspective from the West. First, a huge thanks to Rob Walker for bringing me on stage and all the way up from California. So I want to talk a little bit about your worst day. What do you think about the worst day you've ever had and the worst moment? And there are two things that you can control on your worst day. Everything that led up to that moment, and that's the proactive, that before, that left of boom, and how you responded to that worst moment, your reactive, your resilience, what came following that event. Those are the only two things you really control in life, right? Use that model for anything. So if we have, and we know, the worst day in my world is when a cyber attack converges with physical security, loss of life, cause of tremendous harm and catastrophic injury. That's the worst day. So what do we do to prepare for that? Well, left of boom, people, process, technology, all those things my fellow panelists talked about. Right of boom, it's how we responded to it. What did we do to get back up and going as quickly as possible? So in the law, the world I live in, that is really what measures in the litigation. You are evaluated as a business between your left of boom, everything you did proactively, and right of boom, how you responded. Did you detect it? Was there automated detection? And so I don't think they are mutually exclusive. We have to have both. And more importantly, and we'll talk a little bit about this, we have to call to action a synergy between public and private sector. So hopefully we'll give you some actionable guidance on how we can do that.
Thank you, Justine. I do want to just give you all a heads up that at the last 5-minute period, we will turn to some Q&A, unless it's just gotten too lively and we can't get there. So start planning your questions. In all of your answers to the first question, you've started to bring out the relationship between physical and cyber protection and resilience. And, one of the earliest programs, who here remembers BZPP? Anybody remember border zone or buffer zone protection plans? So the very first kinds of things that we would focus on were those post 9/11 physical issues, right? How do we protect our government facilities and our critical infrastructures in a very physical way? But as all of you are starting to point to, this is equally a cyber issue. It's equally a cyber issue. So let's turn to that relationship between cyber and physical for just a minute. I want to share with you, one of our other colleagues, Scott Cooper, sent a very thoughtful note as we were planning and preparing for today's discussion. And he said one of the challenges is to find the right balance between incentives mandates and cooperation in achieving this form of security. For instance, every company has an incentive to lock the doors on their business and install cameras, hire a security guard. The government doesn't need to mandate any of those types of behavior in cyberspace because the incentives are natural if they know that the problem is there. But businesses, have the incentive to call the authorities if there's a break-in, right? So when we take these analogies and we put them into cyberspace, many have not yet achieved a consensus that doors should be locked, or that an investment in cybersecurity is a must-have rather than, that's something we'll do if we have extra money, right? So what are the roles that, when we think about the roles of the critical infrastructure owner-operators for cybersecurity and infrastructure resilience, and the roles of the government in critical infrastructure resilience, how are we working through that balance of responsibility? Who's doing what and why, and how might we want to adjust that? I'll just throw that open. Okay, don't be too quiet here.
Well, Emily, I would say that that dichotomy alone is probably insufficient to deal with what we are seeing, particularly in the cyberspace, where there are probably a class of companies that have an even heightened responsibility because of the ubiquity of their technology underpinning much of what we do. So, I often use this example: getting 56,000 water utilities to do anything is very hard. Getting the small number of companies that provide the cybersecurity and underlying technology to all 56,000 water utilities is far simpler and more direct and likely to have a greater impact on the security umbrella. Now, we do want everyone to have some baseline level of cybersecurity to ensure their overall security and resilience of their systems, but there is probably a greater degree of obligation on those companies that really underpin all of our critical infrastructure to build in security by design, to make it easy to implement by the people who are utilizing their technology, to make sure that they're minimizing misconfigurations by unsophisticated users of their goods, and that they're very quick at addressing potential vulnerabilities in their underlying technology. So those are obligations on some parts of our critical infrastructure, probably more important parts of our critical infrastructure because of their ubiquity, and that the federal government is there to help support all of them, provide guidance and support to the individual asset owners and operators, but also to help work with the more sophisticated companies as they are looking at addressing the most sophisticated threats and risks that we face. There is a place for regulation, but that is always going to be, in the United States, a relatively small part of the overall security architecture that we've built. And I think that's really where we are in terms of how we're trying to work through this problem.
That's you've drawn an excellent and helpful distinction. Are there levers where we can achieve more positive impact by dealing with those who provision the multitude of endpoints, right? Is that a lever of influence where we can make more impact? Other thoughts on this issue?
I'd love to hear who in the room is in critical infrastructure. Put your hand up. Are you responsible for securing critical infrastructure? And now, who in you is the room works for a private company, privately held company? Okay. This is what makes America great, and this is what makes America vulnerable. Our foreign adversaries' critical infrastructure is owned by their government. In the United States, our private sector owns critical infrastructure for the most part. Now, some of the water treatment plants you mentioned, the one in Florida, in 2021, there was an attack and a cyber actor got into their system. The water treatment operator sees his mouse moving around on his computer. And he thinks, well, that's not right. He's opening all these things. And one of the things he opened was sodium hydroxide and started dumping in 100 times the level that was supposed to be there. This is the convergence of cyber and physical security. And so luckily, he was able to see that and make the change. But our private sector owns and is responsible for security. So Emily, you mentioned this idea of, well, is it a nice to have? Is it a need to have? Or are there extra resources? Our country is built, and the bylaws and the articles of incorporation of these private equity companies basically say you have to make money. right? And that's the financial incentive that we're up against. So if there's extra money, sure, everybody, I think, fundamentally agrees our doors need to be locked. Our digital infrastructure needs to be locked down. Nobody disagrees with that. It's whether or not there are adequate resources to the people that understand it, true security professionals, to the types of policies that are really going to be implemented in an organization that take money to implement, and the technology that needs to be updated and patched. So this is the problem, and hopefully all the people in this room have some good answers and can take some action on it.
Yeah, I have one thing to say to you, Justine, and then over to you, Greg. One of the things I've been thinking about is we've been struggling with this question of cost recovery for utilities, right? So specifically back to your point, Brandon and Justine, about when we're dealing with utilities that may be municipally owned, many may be governed by state utility commissions. How are we negotiating those important dialogues with the regulators at the state level so that they fully back cost recovery for this very, obviously biased, but necessary expenditure? This is not optional. We don't want sodium hydroxide dumped in our water supply. The only way around that is additional cybersecurity investment. So tricky question there with the cost recovery process.
Well, there was no multi-factor authentication for this water treatment plant in Florida. And it was a shared password that was being used for remote access from home. So you get to dump 100 times the sodium hydroxide from the convenience of your own home, or if you're the guy who did it, from the convenience of Russia. So, there is absolutely no reason for it. There's no good reason. And we have to, high tide raises all boats. We have to raise that tide. And hopefully some people in the room have answers, or perhaps fellow panelists.
Greg, answers?
So the integration of information technology and operational technology is, I'll say, a relatively new phenomenon. Most organizations over the last 20, 25 years have recognized the importance of securing their internal information technology systems and their architecture and their network. But it wasn't until, I'll say, fairly recently, in the last decade, that we've really seen advanced cyber attacks against critical infrastructure industries. For example, if you look at what the Dragonfly organization has done, which it sounds like a nice name, but trust me, it's not. It's some of the most advanced cyber actors supported by the Iranian government that target critical infrastructure industries all over the world. And so they've been exploring all aspects of critical infrastructure and their capabilities in the integration between IT and OT now since about 2010, from what we've been able to track. And we've seen all kinds of attacks, from distributed denial of service to business email compromise, to advanced ransomware attacks by REvil and Condent and BitLock and a host of other cyber attack groups. So what we at Peraton have done is, over the last 10 years, invested a lot of research and development at Peraton Labs. And if that name's not familiar to you, think of AT&T and Bell Labs. So the history goes back over 100 years. And for the last 10 years, we've done a lot of research in this integration between IT and OT. And we developed about 5 years ago a system of sensors and integrated software that we call Secure Smart. And Secure Smart, think of it as an advanced data analytics capability combined with advanced sensors to be able to track an energy grid, track the flow, be able to track the radio frequency signals associated with any IoT devices that are connected to it, be able to do binary analysis, be able to do code analysis, and even look at user behavior, to your point, right? And so what if you could do all of that live on any critical infrastructure network, the operational technology, and be able to do that in a real-time fashion and have the ability to not only detect attacks, whether it's an infiltration or an exfiltration of data or the manipulation of an IoT device like a pressure sensor or a control gate or a temperature sensor or whatever it might be associated with that grid, and then be able to remediate attacks on a real-time automated basis. So that's exactly what we've done. And we call that Energy Defender. And it's a part of a whole product line that we've developed and we've tested and we've deployed with and demonstrated it to the Department of Homeland Security, to the Department of Energy, to the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. So at Peraton, we're trying to help mitigate some of those challenges through technology.
So here we're thinking about how do we understand what are the necessary capabilities, not just in business systems, but the systems that operate the infrastructure function itself. And what are the necessary capabilities to see, just like we can see with our intrusion detection systems and intrusion prevention systems with business technology, can we see similarly in the functional technology that controls our energy, our water? Right? So necessary capabilities crossing those lines. Mark, what are your thoughts coming from Duke Energy on this?
Yeah, Emily, Justine talked about in the United States the reason why companies exist are to return value to shareholders and to customers, right? That's why that's capitalism, right? And the same people, there are going to be people targeting critical infrastructure, whether they're criminals, whether they're domestic terrorism groups, whether they're international terrorism groups, whether they're state-sponsored intelligence agencies. Well, law enforcement and the USIC, they're going to be seeing these same people, right? The job of law enforcement, the job of the intelligence community is to identify and mitigate these bad actors' activities. So as Justine talked about, right a boom, left a boom, right? You don't have to wait to right a boom to then wait till there's a break-in and call a cop. You need to be talking to left a boom, coordinating between the businesses and the governments in order to identify and mitigate the bad actors.
All right. Oh, Justine, you have a second.
Well, it's a actionable guidance. Who's a member of InfraGard? Okay. Go talk to Sandy Moll, the president for InfraGard National. This is where you develop the relationship with your FBI. You know, find your local FBI agent, and DHS CISA is putting out a ton of good resources and information, and so that information can flow, and this is where you develop those relationships. So sign up for InfraGard.
Good plug there, Justine. InfraGard's awesome.
And it's free.
And it is terrific. Those kinds of countrywide, state and local, they're human relationships. They're not just some sort of listserv, right? Where you get to know your government officials and your fellow critical infrastructure owner-operators. There is no comparison to being able to respond if you actually know those people in advance. Those relationships are essential. So, foot stomping the point there. Also, the regional approaches that CISA is pushing right now, much of our infrastructure is regional, right? Get involved in the region. Understand what you have in the region. Understand how to talk to your fellow owner-operators and how to talk to CISA. Very important, those local relationships. So I'm going to turn to another question, and the question is, basically, we started this field in 1996 with the President's Commission on Critical Infrastructure Protection, right? So 1996. Then we were catalyzed into pretty big action, 9/11. Here we are, we're in 2022. We've been at this for 20 years in a dedicated, concerted way. What are we good at? What are we really good at now? And where is it we need to get in the next 5-10 years? Thoughts on that?
We're really good at evolving, I will say.
We're good at evolving.
We're good at resilience. It's not these failures, these shared information. We're good at learning from the other mistakes. I want to talk about two other mistakes that were made, both based on lack of multi-factor authentication and reasonable security. And they both happened in 2021, and they both sent a clear message by foreign adversaries to the United States that we can hit you on east, west, and in the middle of your country. So we talked about one of them. That was Florida, and that was water treatment. Another one happened, you might have heard the Colonial Pipeline. Anybody impacted by not being able to get gas or fly somewhere because 5,500 miles of our Colonial Pipeline was encrypted? That was because somebody left the company, they did not disable the account, and they used a password to get in, a legacy password. There's no reason that password should have been existing because there shouldn't have been an account. So that was oil. And the third one is JBS, is a meatpacking plant. And so they've got ability to affect our water, ability to affect our food, and our ability to affect our energy. That was a clear message from our foreign adversaries. So when we talk about what are we good at, we're good at going to bat and having action. And so in response to that, and I think Director Wales is probably in a better position to talk about how our country responded to that, but DHS CISA was pumping information. So when Log4j happened, this was bad guys figured out how to exploit an open source code. And by the way, it wasn't baked in by an insider threat. This was just a vulnerability that existed that was exploited. What we did as a country was amazing. We put up on a website, we had lots of shared information. Here's how you patch it, here's how you fix it. So the butterfly effect of Log4j is ongoing and will continue to be ongoing. But maybe somebody else wants to talk.
Can we take just a moment? I think, Justine, not everyone here may have tracked fully Log4j. So we, in December of 2020, we had what I would call a major cyber supply chain attack in the form of SolarWinds. And what I feel like between SolarWinds, in 2020 and then Log4j in 2021, each one was public knowledge in the December of that year. So we're a year apart, and I would say they're very, very different, right? So SolarWinds is a deliberate adversary action within a cyber supply chain. Log4j is something that we'd been tracking because we do quite a lot of software quality checks for our sponsors, and that was not even a medium in some of our scanning tools, right? So Log4j is showing up as a low or a medium. It's not a particularly high vulnerability. It's an open source, library. It's not something anyone's watching particularly. Now all of a sudden, it screams itself up to high, right? So it's just a very different feeling when something you knew about, but it didn't seem to be a priority, is all of a sudden a priority. Whereas SolarWinds, I think, for 18 to 24 months, we didn't even know. So I think there are all kinds of different forms that this cyber incursion is taking as it comes into our lives in a most unwelcome way. You've pointed out we're good at evolving. Okay, awesome. We'll turn back to the poll once we have this chunk here, because this is meaty. So that's a great point. And now, Mark, over to you.
I would say something that we are good at that we weren't good at 10 years ago was identification of the insider threat. Right? 10 years ago, I think you'd be hard-pressed to go to a private company and ask about their insider threat program. And I think after some high-profile cases across the country, the identification of state-sponsored IP theft programs, the requirement by the Department of Defense for cleared defense contractors to have insider threat programs has driven that along. I think we're in a much better place today than we were 10 years ago. Where we have to get better is in that same area, insider threat. I think so many of us focus on insider threat programs, putting it in a cybersecurity program, looking at things like data classification, data loss prevention, data exfiltration. But really, when you look at an insider, you need to look at an insider holistically. You've got to look at their behavioral indicators, because we know the majority of the behavioral indicators on insiders are going to be the same, regardless of the sector of where they're operating or what they're taking. So I think we've come a long ways, but we've got a long ways to go.
Good points. Brandon?
I would also say, and this builds on something that Justine said, related to our ability to kind of come together and, I think, take the appropriate joint actions between government and industry when there's kind of a galvanizing event. So I think Justine kind of highlighted a couple of them. I think in one case, I'll give an example of where we were kind of ahead of the potential threats, and that was the kind of collective response to the potential Russian invasion of Ukraine. So this was where we started doing work in November and December of last year with our critical infrastructure partners, where we had intelligence that we believed Russia was likely to invade early in the new year. And we started bringing in partners, providing them with the context at a classified level about here is what we think may happen, here are the potential implications for the homeland, here is what you could be doing now to get prepared, and please help us make sure that when we start going public, how do we make sure that we put out a message that will resonate with the broader community? And that work kind of continued through the kind of spring, where as we were getting new insights from our intelligence community about where Russian threat actors may be looking domestically, we were able to bring together partners across the country with the FBI to talk about specific threats and how the specific sectors that may be targeted were going to react. And I think that's kind of a good example of something that probably would not have happened 15 years ago, but today was pretty smooth in our execution. And there's always ways we're looking to kind of improve the kind of speed and agility in which we operate. But I think it's a good example of how this partnership has kind of matured over the past 15, 20 years.
Excellent, excellent point. You know, I was thinking back to something, I've lost the bubble on this, but there was an activity that became quite mature and resilient around how do we do this function, what you have just described, for things that we can reasonably anticipate. So let's anticipate the Super Bowl, right? Let's take a look at the Super Bowl. What events do we anticipate occurring around it and across public and private lines? Let's make sure we're ready. So it could be, are we looking for human trafficking? Are we looking for bombs in the stand, right? And get that plan in place. So your point about we can come together across public and private lines, we can strongly prepare when we can see it coming, that's a strength. That's a strength that we have now, a muscle we've built. Greg.
You know, I think we've really made improvements across most of the fronts. If you think back 15, 20 years ago, how many of you had ever really been made aware of cybersecurity threats? And so the cybersecurity level of awareness, education and training, I think has grown dramatically. If I think back to 10 years ago, if I were to go and talk to most of the, I'll say, major critical infrastructure industries, boards of director about their cybersecurity, I think there'd be very little awareness at that time in terms of having incident response plans and system security plans in place. And using technologies and tools like advanced software encryption and multi-factor authentication, identity, credential, and access management. You know, they would probably wonder what I was thinking, right? But today, these are all fairly commonplace terms. So I think, you know, we need a level of recognition of the advancement we've made in education, training, and awareness. At the same point, I think we've made tremendous advancement in incident response in our technologies, in our capabilities, the use of automation and machine learning. Where I think we still have a far ways to go is adoption. Because the mere fact that we have so many tools and technologies and capabilities does not mean that all the government agencies or all the critical infrastructure industries have actually adopted it, okay? And so it is that gap between the state of the technology and the advancement of capabilities and the actual adoption and implementation of those capabilities that I think is where, as a nation, we're still struggling.
There's so
That's a
much
great
choice.
point, yeah.
It's like going into a grocery store. I like to shop at small grocery stores because if there's too much choice, I have trouble making a decision. And it's true for like framework. What framework do you follow? Well, there's lots of frameworks to follow. You follow NIST, ISO, right? What framework even can be a challenge? Critical security controls. I just want to mention one thing about, and I know I already had my turn, Emily, but we talked a little bit about security and control, but I want to talk about our hierarchy of needs. These are human needs, but they can apply really beautifully to a corporate context. So Abraham Maslow, about 100 years ago, wrote about the fundamental human needs, and he said that human beings have an innate need to be all they can be. Right, and I am encouraged from conversations I had last night that this is a very type A group, right? This is a very smart group, intelligent group, and individual and humans who want to be all they can be. And with that, there's some fundamental needs you have to have met before you can be all you can be. You have to have food, you have to have love, and you have to have security. And these are fundamental needs that we have to have. And if you apply that to a business context, we don't feel very secure right now as a country and in our businesses. And for some of the reasons, Mark, you talked about, which is insider threat. You know, we're sleeping with the enemy. We know that China has plans and has said very actively that they will place people inside organizations. Has anybody seen Made in Beijing? You know, if you don't believe me, just watch the documentary about the prosecutions of Chinese nationals placed intentionally into American companies. Right. So we're not feeling secure. So the answer to that, just like love and food, this is not a solo sport. This is something that requires all of us to come together. And from that highest level, what Greg mentioned, from that highest board level, the SEC, NYDFS, now require your boards to care in order to have oversight over cyber matters, whatever that's going to look like. I know we're doing a lot of board education, but it's also going to require executive leadership. So developing a common language in those incident response plans, tabletopping ransomware from your board to your executive leadership to the plant operator who's monitoring his mouse moving around. Everybody, it's all of us.
Thank you. You know, I was hoping we'd have time for a really robust Q&A session. We kind of don't. But I want to just offer a few minutes here for you all to take the floor and ask some questions if you have them, while we put up the poll in the background. We'll do the poll and the Q&A all at the same time.
I was wondering if we could briefly zoom out a little bit and talk about a continuity of the economy plan, and if you think that would potentially or will play a special role when emphasizing public-private partnerships and critical infrastructure resilience.
Brandon, that feels like it's for you.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, I don't think the plan will change the nature of the public-private partnership because it is already kind of core to all of the work that we do. I think the goal of the plan is to make sure that we are focusing that partnership in the right places. Are we engaging with the right elements of the economy to make sure that the most critical functions are the ones that are going to be maintained in the face of adversary threats or real-world incidents? So I would argue that the continuity of the economy plan is much more about where our partnership are existing and what we're trying to get out of them, as opposed to something that's really critical to the maintenance of the public-private partnership, which I would, again, say is kind of core to all of our missions.
Thanks. Any other perspectives from the panel on that question? And then we'll take one more. All right, over to you. Is there a mic near you?
Thanks for doing this. I'm Priscilla with CNN. This is a question for Brandon. With an election around the corner, how confident do you feel about infrastructure security there, and what conversations are you having with election officials across the country?
Sure. I mean, it's a good question, and election security continues to be a top priority for the agency and for, frankly, across the U.S. government. I think the work that we've done over the past 6 years, since 2016, on cybersecurity, I think has paid tremendous dividends, where we went from a community that was highly skeptical of the federal government's engagement with them at all in the election security space to where they are really hungry for the support that we currently provide. I think we've made tremendous progress in securing those systems, both because of the work that the federal government has done, but frankly, mostly because state and local election officials have put in the time and energy to make sure that their systems are better protected today than they have been in the past. When we talk to election officials, and I think our director has talked about this in the past, their concerns today are with new threats like physical security threats that they may face, and the growing mis and disinformation that's out there related to kind of the core business of how elections are conducted. I would argue that today, elections from a cybersecurity perspective are as strong as they've ever been. We have a lot of confidence in the security and resilience of those systems because election officials are kind of born risk managers, and they've been doing this for a long time. And if they have the support from their citizens in their jurisdiction, we have every confidence that the election will proceed, in a way that's protected against external interference. But it's an incredibly complex environment right now. There are a lot of threats that they face, and our job is to kind of be there for them and give them whatever support we can. But it's not just us. They need, obviously, the support of their local law enforcement to deal with some of the physical threats that they're facing. They need the support of the broader social media companies related to the disinformation that's out there. And ultimately, they need the support of the American people, who are kind of the last line of defense to make sure that the ballots that they submit are accurate, that they're kind of engaging in the process, that they're volunteering to be poll workers that are in desperate need, and so everyone can be part of the solution.
Thanks, Brandon. We do have a slight extension of time thanks to our organizers. So first of all, thank you so much for responding to the poll. It's interesting to see what's landing on top. Clearly, there are any number of actions that we need to think through in terms of how to invest over the next 5 to 10 years to really make an impact, continue making an impact. Securing the supply chain of software, personal passion of mine. Clear guidance and regulation, obviously an ongoing request from the private sector. Make it clear what we have to do. Help us come into compliance. I want to take time just for one more question and then turn to final comments from all of the panelists here. Any last question out there? Yes, sir.
We have discussions with a lot of senior executives from Fortune 100 companies to small companies. And it's disheartening what you find as what we refer to as the ostrich theory of management, where they feel that they don't have to spend any money on a lot of these issues because they don't feel like they're targets and they'll deal with it if it doesn't happen. How do we get these organizations more focused and understanding that these are investments they need to make up front because they're much cheaper to deal with the issue in a preventative manner than it is to throw buckets of money after it? You've had an issue that's attacked your facility. Because most of these public companies, if they do get attacked, they lose 40% of their customers as a result of it and a significant amount of their valuation.
Honestly, that fact right there, it speaks for itself. But, each of the panelists, what do you think about this particular issue? How do we catalyze the necessary levels of investment?
How do you lift the ostrich's head out of the sand that is intentionally placed there? I think we're doing that now. Those 3 attacks that I talked about in 2021, those were companies that didn't think that they were high value targets. And so because of that, they didn't have security. So we shine the light and we cast awareness on it. And I'll borrow from Maya Angelou, if we know better, we do better. We know better. We just have to get the word out to the people that can actually take action. So the call to action for the folks in this room is carry it forward. Don't be content with the information you learned today. Do something with it. Tell people in your region. Have a CLE. Do something with it. Because if people know better, they will take action and they will do better. These are easy fixes.
Shine a light, says Justine. Greg?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is about education, training, and awareness from the top down, from the board level on down. If you can make it impactful to a board of directors as to the level of risk that cyber is and how it can really affect their bottom line, their reputation, and to recognize the potential impacts to their entire business operations from an operational technology standpoint, I think it becomes meaningful and clear, evident quite rapidly. I do want to also say that there's a lot of initiatives that DHS and CISA has done in a very positive, productive outreach way to try to build the partnership relationships. One that I'll credit the organization with is called the Cyber Sentry program, in which they've worked a volunteer relationship with a lot of energy and power companies and critical infrastructure to say, hey, we have tools and capabilities and we can provide them to you if you're willing to work in partnership with us. And so I think there's programs like that, and Jen Easterly, the new director for CISA's programs with the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative Organization, bringing in some of the best and brightest from the private sector to provide new technologies and tools and be able to showcase a lot of capabilities. So I think there's a lot of positive things out there that can be built off of, but a lot of it is about awareness.
Join a program. So Brandon and Mark, we're out of time, so how should we wrap this up?
I would just say, we talk a lot about cyber being a team sport, but what that really means is that we all have some responsibility for the solutions that are required here. And I think we've talked a lot today about the different responsibilities in government, the different responsibilities in industry, the different responsibilities for different parts of industry that play critical roles. And it's about bringing all those people together to make sure they understand how they fit into this larger puzzle, and what we all need to do to make sure that we have the right security in place for the future of this country.
And last word goes to you, sir.
Wow. Thanks, Emily. As our threat actors get more and more complex, as their ability to communicate fund and coordinate attacks, get better and better. We have to get better. And how do we do it? We do it through communication and relationship building between the private sector and the public sector. And together, that's the only way we're going to stop them.
Well, you've heard it all. Thank you all for your wonderful insight today. Really appreciate it, and thank you.